And I'm very thankful to the IAS for the opportunity of the small grant. I think that has really helped to forward this research and to look into an innovative and very different approach to how we could tackle underage online sales and reduce the chance of that happening. So firstly, a little bit about myself, even though Sadie has already done a fantastic introduction. I'm a researcher at Wrexham Glyndŵr University in North Wales, and my focus is on information systems and computer science. So I'm not an alcohol expert. I've come at this problem looking at it from an information systems perspective. How can we implement systems that will be able to help to, uh, to reduce the harm? How can we implement these systems that work with the existing retail systems and banking systems to make sure that we can produce something which will work for all retailers, for all banks, and produce a blanket level of approach? My previous work has involved digital agencies. I've worked in industry in the past, developing the kinds of e-commerce solutions that this would apply to. So I'm no stranger to some of the nuances or some of the techniques that you need to sell products online, and some of the challenges of selling those, particularly age-restricted products, and being able to work out which jurisdiction and how all of that can fit together. And as I mentioned before, IS small grant funded. It has been a great opportunity to further this research, and I'll mention more at the end about where this research could go in the future. So starting off with the problem context, why did this research need to be performed? Well, during 2020, partly fueled by the pandemic, UK online alcohol sales have risen by 18.9%. And I'm sure if we have some more recent statistics, it is still going up. Online sales are increasing. And much of this has been driven by consumer demand for delivery at home, whether it's because we've been told to stay at home by the government because of coronavirus, or we find it more convenient. People have realised that getting something delivered to the doorstep is much easier than going out and purchasing it themselves. We also have a high reliance on technology. Everybody is carrying around a mobile phone. They can order anything everywhere. Why should alcohol not be the same? An interesting facet of what's happened after the pandemic, after the lockdowns, as we're coming out of these coronavirus restrictions, hopefully, is that there hasn't been a decline in post-lockdown use. So as people have started going out, they've been able to go to the shops, they've been able to go to pubs, they've been able to go out and to buy alcohol physically, as we used to do a few years ago. It means that there has been no decline in the use of the apps. People are still ordering online, people are still ordering to their doorstep, and there is still a surge in the fast food, the delivery apps that we've become accustomed to. The big key challenge in this is that the Licensing Act was last written in 2003 or 2005 and focused on physical sales. The Licensing Act was always focused around the idea that you would walk into a shop. You would walk into a shop, pick something off the shelf, and somebody could check your physical ID. Unfortunately, in the online world, this is not possible, and it's very hard to be able to identify somebody's identity or their age and to be able to make sure that they comply with all of the relevant regulations. And this is a key challenge for online retailers. Some prior research identified that 81% of online retailers wanted stronger age assurance mechanisms because these would help to protect their brand's reputation. This isn't just about regulatory compliance. This is also about ensuring that retailers appear to be doing the right thing, that they appear to be doing good by restricting access to these products, and also they are complying with those legal requirements and doing it in a way which isn't obstructive to customers. It's not preventing people who can buy alcohol from doing so. The legislation in the UK is, let's be honest, a little bit of a minefield to work through. There are so many different pieces of legislation which apply to age-restricted products, and alcohol is only one of them. This is incredibly complex, both for retailers and also for enforcement to understand. So how do you ever go about understanding which age restrictions apply when, how that's going to be enforced, what the regulations are, and what you need to do to comply with that? To make this even harder, there are certain pieces of key legislation which have got different age restrictions. There are 12 plus, 16 plus, 18 plus restrictions across different products in the UK. And there are also different regulations on how those might be supplied, whether this is in a physical store or in the online sense. So in a physical store, it's much easier to be able to check ID and to check that somebody is old enough to purchase a product. I'm sure everybody has seen the signs for Challenge 25. Maybe you're lucky enough to still be challenged yourself if you're in a shop. And this is a way for retailers to have a blanket policy, make it easy to check ID and to make sure that people are the age that they need to be to purchase products. No similar scheme exists online. And some of the physical retailers who make deliveries themselves have got Challenge 25 policies. So their delivery drivers will check if you think that you look under 25, what your date of birth is to check that you're old enough to receive a product. Other organisations, so third-party delivery services and delivery apps, have got totally different policies in the way that they operate. There is no one standard, there is no one system, and this is something which can be hard for retailers to decide how they need to implement it. The other problem is it pushes the problem down to delivery drivers, the people who are potentially the most vulnerable in the system. Delivery drivers will turn up at a house, they've got a basket of products, they're told that something is age restricted, and they have to make that decision on the doorstep. It's notoriously hard to be able to identify somebody's age, and this is why policies like Challenge 25 have got a 7-year range where they say if you look over under 25, you'll be checked. If you're over 25, you're okay. It's very hard to tell if somebody is 18 or not, and this is especially hard on the doorstep outside of the retail environment. So pushing this down to delivery drivers doesn't put in place a sufficient mechanism for retailers to be sure that they comply with all of the relevant legislation. There's no clear guidance for online sales either. So even though there are all of these different pieces of legislation within the UK, which are related to age restricted products, very few of them give any guidance to online sale. And in fact, the only ones which are relevant are the latest pieces of legislation which have not yet been approved or are going through different stages, like the Age Assurance Minimum Standards Bill. So this means that there is little guidance to retailers other than what industry standards are, what industry norms are, and the technologies that come along with that. So this can be challenging for a retailer to decide how they're going to enforce this legislation, how they are going to be responsible in selling age-restricted products. This research does build on some prior work, which Sadie kindly mentioned before the start of my presentation. And this prior work, funded by Alcohol Change UK, was focused around identifying the challenges of underage alcohol sales online. It was focused very specifically on looking at how much of a problem that is and what solutions could be prepared. The report came out with 5 key recommendations. The first, that the law must be clarified. And this is still the case, even though we have some bills like the Age Assurance Minimum Standards, which is currently going through parliamentary processes, the law still needs to be clarified around products like alcohol. At what point is that delivery made? At what point do we need to check that somebody is old enough to purchase or receive that product? We need to make sure that the existing safeguards are sufficient for the mechanisms that need to be put in place to reduce the sale of age-restricted products to those underage. We need to consider shopping baskets with each item individually, so making sure that the age restriction of each item is considered on its own. And this can be tricky where there are multiple products with multiple age restrictions. There's a whole host of different age restrictions across products in the UK rather than a blanket policy. And the more exciting parts of that report that came out of that, which lead into this current research, was the use of MCC codes and bank authorization processes being extended to cover age restrictions. At the moment, there's no attempt made to check that somebody who makes a purchase, that their card is held by somebody of the correct age to make that purchase. And it seems like an obvious extension that could be made to help enforce a blanket policy. Finally, making sure this fits with emerging technology. We've seen the growth of delivery apps. There's also other technologies out there which need to fit in with the current research and the framework. So this might be artificial intelligence. It might be about having different delivery mechanisms or different ways of selling those products online. So any approach needs to make sure that it's future-proof and can work in conjunction with other technologies. Some key technology that you might hear in the age assurance space are these three terms: age estimation, age assurance, and age verification. So starting at the bottom, age estimation. This is the most basic thing that a retailer can do to decide on somebody's age. They can estimate the age based off some data. Now, this might be a photo of the person, it might be a video of the person, it might be some bits of information that they've gained from their accounts, but this data isn't checked. And this means that an estimation can only ever be an estimate. This might be okay for some purposes if you're viewing some types of online content or you want broad restrictions, but certainly in terms of alcohol sales, the law is absolute. You must be 18 to be able to purchase and receive that supply. So age estimation for alcohol sales is very hard to achieve. And this is why we need to step up to the next level, age assurance. Age assurance is where extra steps are taken to improve the confidence that somebody is old enough to purchase a particular product. So age assurance goes to the level that it checks some of that information. It might be checking against certain databases or correlating it with information, applying additional technologies to help improve that estimation. And at the top level, we have age verification. Age verification is where there is an absolute that we know this person is definitely old enough. Whether this is with government issued ID, so something like a passport, a driving license, or a pass card, it might be about verifying that person using electoral roll information or other online databases. So age verification is sort of the gold standard. Age assurance is a good way to get a good estimate and making sure that you protect somebody's privacy in the process without making it cost prohibitive. And age estimation is about saying, yes, they're probably old enough. So in terms of applying the regulations, we have to be sure that somebody is old enough in order to sell them the product. And in terms of the current industry practice, age assurance is often used to cover these three different terms. Historically, age verification was always considered the term because it was about absolute proof with ID. And this is what you might have if you walk into a supermarket and try to buy an age-restricted product. But online, this is much, much harder to implement. Even if somebody sends in some ID, you don't know that the person is a person they purport to be. So it's much more challenging to have age assurance in the online world. As part of the research, I did a study of the current age assurance technologies that are out there, applied by retailers and also applied within digital spaces. And it became clear looking at some of these technologies that there was a couple of different dimensions that these could be considered under. The first is the passive active dimension, which is shown across the bottom of this graph. So passive is where there is little interaction for the customer. Passive techniques and technologies are where the customer isn't even aware that you're applying that technique. This just happens in the background and it doesn't require much interaction or involvement at all. As we go to the right-hand side of that graph, we have the more active technologies. These require customer intervention. The customer needs to do something to be able to prove their age and to be able to prove their identity in order to proceed with a purchase. The other dimension going upwards is friction. And friction is a consideration of how much effort a user would need to put in to be able to interact with that system and to make a purchase. Now, if you're a legislator, you're probably thinking we want to go for the mechanisms which are the best, the most active, make the customer jump through enough hoops that they've supplied some ID, so something like a photo of an ID document, or purchasing a token in a shop, which was one of the proposals under the Digital Economy Bill. On the other hand, if you're a retailer, you want to reduce the friction as much as possible. So for a retailer, what you want to do is use the simplest mechanisms possible. You want to use the simplest mechanisms, which mean that the customer doesn't realize this is taking place, but also if they do have to interact, it's simple for them. So that it means that the customer can easily check out with you and not leave and go to one of your competitors' websites. So all of these different technologies are explained and overviewed in the report. Some of the key ones are the ones at the bottom, which are the older mechanisms. The idea of age gates, where you either check a box or just specify your age. I think those are generally considered to be outdated now and insufficient for the legislation. But in the early days of the internet, that was a standard approach. Checking you have a credit card, that also isn't a way that can be used these days to detect if somebody is of an appropriate age. But it's also a course mechanism because that applies an 18 plus age limit and nothing else. As we go up to the top right of that chart, we get into the ID check on delivery, which is what's performed by delivery drivers at the moment. We also have photos of ID documents, so you have to take a photo of your driving license or your passport and send it in to be able to make a purchase, or the token purchase, which is where you would go to a physical shop, purchase a token, and then use that to prove your age online. In the middle, we also have the AI facial verification, so technologies where they use facial technology to be able to identify an estimate of somebody's age. And we also have things like electoral roll checks, so very heavy checks to be able to check if somebody is a person that they say online prior to making a delivery. So a key point about these technologies is that they don't have to be used in isolation. And you may find some retailers use one or more of these in combination in order to provide a better compliance with the legislation. And this is generally considered to be a better approach and a more customer-friendly approach. If you could use estimation measures and you find out that somebody is aged over 50, why would you need to ask for their ID? So if you can combine these together to be able to hone in on different technologies to use that are most appropriate for the customer, then this is obviously a good approach. So building on this, the suggestion in the report to use what are called MCC codes could help, being one of those technologies combined with the other technologies that already exist. So moving on to the technique that could be used according to the report. Well, it uses the card payment processing systems that all online retailers need to interact with. Almost all retail transactions online go through either a debit or a credit card, and that means that they follow this process. The customer will input their card details, and these are passed to the retailer. The retailer then sends that transaction to their bank, the acquirer merchant bank. They also include an MCC code in there identifying the type of transaction. So they'll say, is this a grocery transaction? Is this a petrol station? If it's a physical petrol station, is it gambling transactions? All of these have got different codes which are sent to the bank. The bank then sends this on to the card scheme. This would be something like Visa or MasterCard, who then forward it to the issuer bank. That's the customer's bank who has all of their banking details. The issuer bank then decides whether to accept or decline that transaction. Perhaps they think that it's a fraudulent use of your card, or it might be that you don't have enough money left in your debit account. So they might decline the transaction or approve and say, yes, we're going to pay the retailer this money out of your account. The card scheme forwards that response back to the acquirer bank, and this gets sent to the retailer, and the retailer shows the message confirming or declining the transaction. Well, the MCC code flows all the way through this process, that identifier of the type of transaction. And some typical MCC codes that might be used, some of these are for physical stores, but also for online purchases, are things like convenience stores, we've got discount stores, grocery stores and supermarkets, miscellaneous shops. All of these have their own code, which identify the type of transaction. But rather than identifying a transaction as just being groceries, so 5411, this could be extended. And if this mechanism was extended, then we could create some more codes. And these are some suggested codes which are still available within the MCC code space. So there could be a code for each particular age restriction. So there could be a 12 plus code, a 15 plus code, 16 plus, 18 plus, 21 plus, which might be relevant in other countries like the USA, and also no restriction would still be the current code. What this means is that when the customer's bank receives a transaction, they can look at the MCC code and they can say, oh, this code has got a number of 5488. We know that means 18 plus, so we'll check that the cardholder is 18 plus. This would mean that the blanket transactions, accept or decline, could be made by the bank based on the age restrictions applied by the retailer. Retailers already have this data about the age restrictions and apply this in different jurisdictions. So if there were differences between purchasing something in different countries or different parts of the UK, then the different MCC codes could be supplied to the bank in order to demonstrate this. So using the MCC code to build on existing technologies, it wouldn't need an entirely new technology in order to show how that could work. And it would be easy to implement for both retailers and banks. It's not a whole additional technology, it's about changing a code which is already there. Incidentally, the MCC codes, this is a technology currently used by the banking system to apply the legislation from last year that bans gambling on credit cards. So there are particular MCC codes for gambling, and if a bank sees these and it's applied to a credit card, they decline the transaction. This technology is already used for a very similar purpose. So how would this process work? Well, it's about going through each item in the basket and identifying if there is an age restriction. So the customer would add all of the items to their shopping basket as normal. At the payment stage, the algorithm would go through each of these items. It would identify any age restrictions, and then the retailer would use the highest age restriction. So if you've got a number of items in your basket and some have got, let's say, 12 plus, 16 plus, and an 18 plus restriction, then the 18 plus MCC code would be used by the retailer. And this would mean that the bank would just need to check that we've got 18 plus, and that could be applied to the whole of that order. So the bank would accept, authorize or decline that transaction based on the customer's date of birth, which has already been proved by government issued ID. And if that transaction is declined, the customer would be shown a message. They could go back and take out some of those age restricted products. So this is very retailer friendly, that if somebody orders something, they don't realize they can't buy it, they can always take it out of their basket and try again before they get to the point of it turning up on the doorstep and it having to be taken away again. There are some exceptions to where this might work or might not work. The first is debit cards. Debit cards are used by lots of younger people because you can have them from the age of 11 plus. And this means that the age restrictions would need to be applied in these situations, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to apply an 18 plus restriction by the presence of a card. And this is where some of the earlier credit card mechanisms became quite tricky to implement. But debit cards could still be used as long as they apply the relevant age restrictions before taking money out of the customer's account. There might be situations where a child has a card on a parent account. This would need some consideration on the banking side of things to make sure that the card holders who are signed up to the account their age is recorded and that their age is recorded against a particular card. It is possible to get additional cards for additional card holders, even though somebody less than 18 can't sign up for a credit card, and making sure their date of birth is recorded and proved by ID would help to close that loop. And the other exception would be prepaid cards. There are really two types of prepaid cards which are used in the UK. The first are the types of cards that are given to children. So you can get prepaid cards to pay pocket money onto, and then kids can go and spend that in a shop or spend it online as they wish with their card. So the child's age would need to be recorded and proved to some form of ID. There's a second type of prepaid card, which is the type that you could just go into a shop and buy. And we found in the prior research that many of the restrictions that are supposed to be placed on those cards aren't by the banks. So you're not supposed to be able to do things like gambling transactions or purchasing certain goods with those cards, but actually you can. And making sure that the age restrictions are applied to prepaid cards would be important. And this could be considered in either one of two approaches: making sure all prepaid cards are registered, which is a very good practice anyway for anti-fraud measures. Alternatively, it could be a case of blocking all age-restricted transactions on prepaid cards, which would make sure that nobody underage could get around the mechanisms using that particular technique. So as part of the research, I prepared an online demo, which is an interactive demo. You can go and try it yourself as well. So you can go to the website, which I'm sure Sadie will send out the link afterwards to you, or we could pop it in the chat. And you can try out this yourself to see how this process would work. And this prototype guides you through a typical customer journey with some age-restricted and non-age restricted products. So you'll see here on the left, I've created lots of available items in my imaginary store that you can choose from to add to your basket. So you might want to be buying something like milk. We might add milk to our basket, but we could also add, let's say we'll add a lottery ticket, and we could also add a 12 plus DVD. So here we have a combination of items, and it's not clear from the outset which restriction would be applied if you're the customer, because you'd be thinking about these items individually. So as we go to the next step, the algorithm will go through these items and decide which restriction to apply. So once the algorithm goes through each of these items, we can see which age restriction is applied to each. Milk is not age restricted, so a pint of milk is absolutely fine for anyone to buy. A 12 plus DVD, you have to be 12, and a lottery ticket, you have to be 18. So because of these particular items that I picked to go into the basket, the algorithm applies the most restrictive age restriction, 18 plus, and it picks the MCC code associated with 18 plus. So in this case, that's 5488. This means that when a transaction is sent to the acquirer bank, it will have this MCC code rather than a standard grocery code of 5411. And this means that the bank will be able to detect that this is an age-restricted purchase with an age of 18. The bank can then decide whether they're going to authorise or decline that transaction appropriately. So to simulate this process, I've also included some payment details of different potential customers. And you can select one of these preset card details here on the right, and that means that you can set up the bank as to whether they're going to authorise or decline particular transactions. So you remember I included a lottery ticket in this purchase. That would have an age restriction of 18. If I say that I've got an age 17 card, so this is a card which is registered to a 17-year-old and attempt to pay, then this will be declined. This will be declined because you're not old enough to purchase those products. However, if I was a 54-year-old and I attempted to pay for these products, then this would be successful. And this would be approved by the bank and it would be allowed. Of course, if it's declined, then the 17-year-old could go back, they could remove the lottery ticket from their basket, and they'd be able to then go through the process all over again. And this would be the same for any of these age-restricted products. So the benefit of having this system is that not only does it apply age restrictions for one type of product, it applies it for them all, whichever way they're delivered. So you don't have to rely on somebody on the doorstep making these checks about age restrictions. These are made according to the purchaser's bank details. And any of those range of products could be checked through this process. So after the presentation, you can go to that link, you can try it yourself with the different products, and it's a good simulation as to how the banking systems might work and whether particular transactions would be approved or declined, depending on the products that you pick for the basket. How could this be implemented? Well, there is a 3-step implementation that would be needed for this process. The first would be to add these new MCC codes to the tables of the card schemes. There are often updates to these tables. They happen a couple of times a year, and this is to account for some of the historic MCC codes in there, which are assigned to particular businesses. For example, hotel chains and airlines have their own dedicated MCC code, and these are often updated. These new codes could be included in there, whether banks have the age restriction approvals or not. So these could be included from the outset for all banks and all card schemes. Banks would then be able to implement these MCC codes as synonyms for the existing general retail codes. So they'd be able to map these codes and say this is still a retail purchase, it just means that there is an age check. Then, as retailers come on board to use this technology, it will be possible for banks to turn on the checking for individual MCC codes. And this would mean that there would be a progressive implementation. If banks in a different jurisdiction, so somebody who has a card from outside of the UK, didn't implement this age restriction, they would still be able to make purchases. This could still be used in combination with all of those other age assurance technologies I spoke about earlier, and you would be able to still make a purchase, but there would be other checks as well to check that somebody is old enough to make that purchase. So why would this be a good scheme? Well, there's 7 different key benefits to this particular approach. The first is legislative compliance. It complies with the legislation across all age-restricted products. It makes sure the purchaser is of a particular age. There is some ambiguity in some of the legislation, such as the Licensing Act, as to whether it's a purchaser or the person receiving it and the point at which that's made. That could be clarified, but also this could form part of additional checks with additional technologies. It's a passive technique, so generally the customer doesn't know that it's happening. They have little interaction with the system. It's just that if you're underage, you're told that your transaction has been declined. This means there isn't additional friction to the customer journey. It doesn't put barriers in place to purchases by those who are old enough. It closes the loop by making sure that a purchase is definitely age verified using a particular government issued ID, because all banks require government ID or electoral checks and other credit checks to open an account. It preserves the user's privacy. So for a customer, you might not want your bank knowing exactly what you're purchasing when making this check, but they don't. All they know is that you're purchasing something which is 18 plus. That could be anything. So only the age restriction is passed to the bank, no details about the individual purchase. It also works with the age appropriate design code, which was published by the ICO back in 2019 to check that online systems are appropriate for use by children, because it would explain exactly why it's been declined and it still allows them to use the service, even though they can't purchase those age restricted products. It could be used as part of a federated approach combined with other age assurance technologies to make sure there's at least a blanket coverage across the retailer's provision for where these sales are made. And finally, it also aligns with industry standards and age assurance standards as to these technologies that could be used. It can be used in combination with other technologies to give a much better confidence in the sale which is being made. Make sure that the sale to a customer has been age checked by multiple technologies, and this can form one baseline which would help to identify any transactions by people who are not of age. So that has been a brief overview of the report, and there's lots more details in the report. There's also the demo that you can try out yourself, so you can play around with that and see how the different codes would be generated based on the different products. And do we have any questions?
Great, thank you, Sally, thanks for that, Jessica. It's really impressive, and I think I'm going to have a go on the test site in a bit. That looks very interesting. I just wanted to clarify a technical point which I didn't quite understand, which is probably why we ask people like you to look at these sort of things for us, because we don't entirely understand. Now, you mentioned about age exceptions and the difference between credit cards and debit cards. Just to be clear, the system that you've outlined and that you've made in your dummy site, would that work with a credit card and a debit card? Would it be able to, it would detect age and block the purchase in the same way, would it?
Absolutely, yes. The way that those cards are processed is exactly the same as far as the card schemes are concerned. So whether you have a debit card or a credit card transaction, it's the same MCC codes, the same messages, and of course the banks will also have to approve your identity whether you have a debit or a credit card. So it would work with both of those. There are some nuances around the age that you need to have either of those.
Right.
So what I was pointing out with that exception is that to have a credit card, you must be 18, which makes it easy to say if you've got a credit card, you must be 18 plus, except in those other circumstances. For a debit card, you can be 11 plus. So this would have the opportunity of providing age restrictions which are under 18, like for DVDs, for video games, etc.
Great, thank you. All right, that's clear. No, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sadie, and thanks, Jess. That was really interesting. Sorry, it's probably a bit of a tricky question, especially as I know you sit more on the computer science side, but do we have a sense, it's probably really difficult to measure, but of how widespread this issue is in the first place? You know, how common are these kind of underage purchases, and what does that tell us about the kind of potential for reducing alcohol harm through these measures?
Thank you, Emily. That's a great question. In the prior research report, which is also linked to in this report, part of the research was about looking at whether this is a large problem, whether it's a problem which needs to be solved. And we identified that there is a particular problem with this. The challenge in quantifying that data is that going to young people and saying, have you purchased alcohol? They'll tend to say, no, of course I haven't, because I wouldn't do that. And it's very hard to get a particular grasp on that. Also, retailers wouldn't particularly want us to probe around in their data and see where those purchases have been made. But where we do have some empirical evidence of this is in the news stories and reports, which have gone back over at least the past 10 years, about delivery drivers leaving products for those underage. And we know of instances where that has been reported and has been investigated as happening. We also know that there's evidence of delivery drivers who have been delivering to those underage, and there have been some more recent reports as well, with particularly the instant delivery apps, where deliveries have been made and products have been left where they shouldn't. There's also some particular challenges with that because they're not trained to identify age. So they're just told to check ID or take somebody's age to prove in that process. And we even found that one of the delivery apps tells the delivery driver just to take the products away and dispose of it themselves if somebody's not old enough, which doesn't seem like a responsible approach either. So what I would say is there's not necessarily much quantifiable data about the problem, but there's certainly many stories out there, many issues as to where this has happened. And that's probably just the tip of the iceberg.
Hi, thanks. It's great to come back to this subject. I think we spoke to the team just over a year ago. I was interested in whether there'd been any conversations with acquiring banks to talk about the technical feasibility of this. It's obviously an international system, and at the moment, the architecture is set up to allocate a code to a premise rather than to a particular purchase. I just wondered if you'd had any conversations and got any sense about how feasible this is.
I have been approached particular people in the banking area. I haven't spoken to any of the banks individually about this technology because they're very notoriously hard to get in touch with and to talk about the architecture of these systems. And this was part of the reason for the report, is so there is a stronger case where this could be made to implement these technologies. But there are certain situations where the MCC code is changed depending on a transaction. And one of those situations in the UK, which happens, is if you go to a petrol station and there is a different code, whether you fill up your car with fuel or you just go in and make a purchase in the shop. So at the moment, this does take place. Those MCC codes are switched dynamically by the till system, whether you have fuel included in there or not. So if you have a purchase which includes fuel, then that will have one particular code. And if you just purchase items out of the shop, that would have a different code. This technology is already in place in a retail environment.
I think there's a presumption here, isn't it, that the person ordering the alcohol is the same person that's subsequently receiving it. And I can think of some scenarios where that might not be the case. For example, a parent makes an order online, passes the relevant age checks via those MCC codes, but then says, for example, to their 14-year-old daughter, I'm going to be in work when this delivery arrives. Can you take this delivery for me? So is there a case that however robust those age checks are online, that they become somewhat irrelevant if then a different person opens their door to receive that delivery? And is there a way perhaps that technology can be utilized on the doorstep and not just at the point of sale?
That's a great question. And of course, there are always going to be edge cases because processing payments and these kinds of transactions are always in a complex environment. So there always will be cases where perhaps somebody can purchase it online and get it delivered to their home and somebody else receives it. This could also be a situation of somebody using somebody else's ID. So if you turn up on a doorstep, it's very hard to tell with a 10-year-old picture on your driving license whether that's the person or not. And these challenges have been considered by many other people in the identity sphere. So in terms of whether this technology could be used in combination with other technologies, yes, I would say it should be. So it's very hard at the moment to ensure that you've complied with the legislation. This would be a way for retailers to have a baseline. They would know that there is a baseline approach, that even though there are some of these loopholes, most of the payments, most of the transactions are made by people who are of a particular age. This might potentially be a higher percentage than what's there now with the current mechanisms or with some of the other technologies. And this is something that could be studied as part of a pilot to understand its comparison with other techniques. But I would say the real value is in using multiple techniques. And this is something which is the same across the age assurance sector, that using multiple techniques is always a good idea for retailers. It closes some of those loopholes. It makes sure that different technologies are used as they're appropriate in the correct situation. As to the doorstep process, well, the doorstep, you might want to do something like checking payment cards. I think that might be quite inconvenient. That has been implemented in other places, like for collecting train tickets, where you have to have the payment card that you bought them with. But of course, all of these technologies have situations where they can't be used in all of those particular contexts, as to making sure that somebody has that particular ID. So I think in terms of doorstep deliveries, yes, checking ID on the doorstep should still happen, but backing this up by the purchase check at the point of purchase, that the payment card is held by somebody who is of an appropriate age, would give more surety to the retailers that they're complying with all of the relevant legislation.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Jessica, very much. That's really interesting. Yeah, mine's really a general question, very general question, rather than being just age appropriate. I was just wondering, with underage drinkers trying to buy online, if stolen credit cards come into play here, if there's any general information known about that.
Stolen credit cards is sometimes a particular issue in some sectors. But in the retail sector, most transactions are checked against the postcode of delivery. So when you go to make a purchase, your house number, your postcode is then checked and authenticated to check that the point of delivery is the same as the one matched to the card. And there are platforms which don't do that check. I think it would be responsible for retailers to do that where there are age-restricted products. But also some retailers, if you made prior purchases, will then let you deliver somewhere else afterwards. All of this means that having the check on the doorstep still is a good idea as a secondary measure, but knowing and being able to apply that beforehand is obviously better. In terms of stolen cards, I think that would also be a fraud issue. So that's something that the banks should be picking up on anyway, if they're being used to purchase for delivery to different addresses, addresses don't match, etc.
Thanks, Sadie, and thank you very much, Jessica, for a really excellent presentation. This is such an interesting report. I think that it's really interesting, the discussion about the weaknesses of the doorstep process, and I suppose this has become more acute during the pandemic, both with the fact that delivery processes have changed and there's less human contact with people, with more parcels just being dropped on doorstep, but also with the increasing concerns about abuse against retail staff. Obviously, a conversation about prohibiting somebody from accessing something they've purchased could potentially unleash quite a hostile conversation. Do you know whether there is appetite amongst retail stakeholders for adopting this technology, which would essentially remove the human contact and the potential for discord for these kinds of transactions?
have had outline discussions with several retailers about this, and there is the idea that anything that they can apply to remove that element from a member of staff who's alone on the street checking somebody's ID would be a good thing, because any checks that you can put in place and stop the product going with a delivery driver would mean that they're subject to less abuse and that the process is much more robust in that way as well. So there is a retailer appetite for doing something before these sales come into play. There is a range of technologies for them to choose from out there at the moment, and it's about choosing something which is appropriate for their level of risk, the amount of age assurance, and works with their other technologies. But the great thing about this particular proposal is that it would work as a baseline. This is a baseline approach for any retailer. It would be easy for them to code, it would be easy for them to access, and retailers would welcome something whereby they have the least effort to implement it, but it also gives the maximal benefits.
So at IAS, we've been doing quite a bit of work around people's drinking during the pandemic, which probably does not come as a surprise. And you mentioned at the start of your presentation that COVID's seen a big increase in online sales of alcohol. And I wondered, based on your knowledge of the digital landscape kind of more broadly, do you anticipate that that's something that is here to stay?
Yes, I think that is definitely something that's here to stay, because it's far more convenient. We're used to using digital technologies. It doesn't really matter about getting things, whether they're delivered to our doorstep or how those things are delivered. The fact that it's more convenient to order online and not go into a store, and you can also make sure that you get the cheapest product, the fastest product. That's something that you can't necessarily do if you go down to the high street, because you would have to walk around many shops, or you would have to go to somewhere which is closest to you. So I think the convenience factor is definitely there. The technology is also getting better in terms of persuading customers to part with their money and to make orders for particular goods. We're also seeing a growth in the number of those services, and also partnerships with retailers, which I think is key to this, that we're seeing many of the very instant delivery services now coming to major retailers, as well as maybe the corner store or separate services as they used to be. So this is definitely something where retailers see an increase, and something where they're investing lots of money into creating platforms that customers want to use. And this is potentially something that will increase into the future. There's also other avenues as well as those instant delivery apps. So things like gift orders, if you're purchasing maybe wine online as well, people want to be able to do this because it's convenient. We're getting more and more used to more of our lives being spent in the digital